All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to treat the modern organization exactly like a complex patient sitting in a doctor's office, desperately in need of a strategic medical diagnosis. Because the truth is, organizations don't just transform successfully by accident. Whenever you're dealing with strategic change, it requires deliberate diagnosis, a really careful classification of what's actually wrong, and then finding the exact right theoretical framework to guide your actions. It's pretty simple. If you misdiagnose the illness, the treatment's going to fail, and your company pays the price.
And we have to start with a number that honestly just blows my mind. We're talking about a massive, shocking statistic here. Somewhere between 60 and 70% of large-scale organizational change initiatives fail completely. Just let that sink in for a second. The financial and cultural costs of poorly managed change are absolutely massive. A majority of the time, we are literally failing to meet our own objectives.
Researchers like Burns and Cotter really hit the nail on the head here. They point out that change is an incredibly difficult epidemic to treat, which means we absolutely cannot just guess the cure. Now, sure, some researchers will caution you against taking those failure rate stats entirely at face value, but the overarching consensus is crystal clear. Change is genuinely incredibly hard. Understanding exactly why change is needed, what specific kind of change is required, and how to structure it meaningfully, well, that's the only way we're going to increase the likelihood of a successful transformation.
So, let's move into part one, the symptoms. What are the actual forces driving organizational change?
It's fascinating how this pressure actually splits into two camps. You've got the chaotic external environment on one side, and then the underlying internal bodily conditions on the other. For those external macro forces, we're talking about massive shifts. Things like the rapid diffusion of AI, crazy inflation, supply chain nightmares, or sweeping regulatory changes like GDPR. But then you have the internal micro forces. These are issues like declining financial performance, clunky legacy technology that's just dragging you down, or maybe a misaligned, completely risk-averse culture. Think about it this way. If you've got external digital disruption crashing into an internal skills gap, man, you've got a compound illness on your hands, and that needs a heavily coordinated response. These forces almost never act alone.
That brings us to part two, the examination. Diagnosing the underlying issues.
Think of these tools as our medical instruments. They're the systematic, analytical scanners we need to figure out what's really going on. We use PESTLE and SWOT as our sort of preliminary scans to weigh the macro environment and our internal capabilities against external threats. But we have to look deeper, right? That's where root cause analysis, like the 5 whys, and process mapping come in. These are absolutely essential. Because if you just apply a shallow intervention to one single team, when the real root cause is a massive toxic cultural issue, well, you're just treating a symptom. You're completely ignoring the disease.
Here's the big takeaway. A misalignment literally anywhere in the system signals a need for strategic realignment, not just a quick Band-Aid. According to the diagnostic congruence model developed by Nadler and Tushman, performance relies entirely on the fit among your strategy, your structure, your people, and your processes. So, if your stated strategy is rapid innovation, but your operational reality requires 10 different manager signatures just to approve a $50 software budget, your organization is sick. Tools like the McKinsey 7S model are fantastic for identifying this exact type of systemic misalignment.
Now, before we go writing a prescription, we really have to classify the exact type of change needed. We need to make sure we aren't using a sledgehammer to crack a nut, right? You have to ask, is this an incremental change, meaning just small, continuous improvements within your existing setup, or is it a radical, frame-breaking change that requires a fundamental shift? Is it episodic, meaning an intentional initiative with a hard start and end date, or is it continuous? Understanding these dimensions is absolutely vital, mostly because the level of resources you're going to need and the amount of resistance you're going to face vary wildly depending on the specific type of change you're actually dealing with. And this perfectly illustrates the danger of misdiagnosis. Treating an adaptive challenge like it's a simple technical problem is a guaranteed way to flatline your entire initiative. Technical changes? They just modify systems or technology. But an adaptive challenge is a whole different beast. It cannot be solved with your existing expertise. It actually requires your people to learn, to shift their core values, and to genuinely change their behaviors. Think about rolling out a new software platform. Installing the actual app, that's a technical problem. Getting your team to actually abandon their beloved old spreadsheets and use the new app, that is an adaptive challenge. It requires behavioral change. If you approach it like you're just installing software, you're gonna fail.
Which leads us perfectly into part 3, the prescription. Choosing the right framework.
Okay, so if you're dealing with an episodic, planned change in a fairly stable environment, Kurt Lewin's foundational model offers a really nice linear cure. It's incredibly famous. You unfreeze the existing equilibrium by overcoming inertia, you change by moving to the new state, and then you refreeze to lock it in and prevent regression. You typically use Lewin's force field analysis alongside this to map out the driving and restraining forces. Now, to be fair, this model does catch some flack for assuming you can ever truly refreeze anything in today's crazy volatile markets. But for a planned transitional change, it is a highly effective structured treatment.
But what if the diagnosis calls for a radical, top-down transformation? That's where Kotter's prescriptive, action-oriented model acts as this highly structured rehabilitation program. It's an 8-step process. You start by establishing an absolute sense of urgency, you build a guiding coalition, you develop the vision, you generate short-term wins to keep everyone's morale high, and eventually you anchor the whole thing in the culture. It is fantastic for those massive CEO-driven transformations, though we do have to recognize that it assumes change follows a predictable sequence and it maybe slightly underplays the organic, bottom-up adaptation of everyday employees.
Now, at the end of the day, organizations are made of people, and the AIDCAR model helps us diagnose exactly where a specific individual is struggling to swallow the pill of change. AIDCAR stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. Its immense value lies entirely in the individual journey. If an entire change initiative is suddenly stalling out, AIDCAR gives you the diagnostic tool to say, okay, our employees have the knowledge of how to change, but they totally lack the desire. It tells you exactly what targeted support you need to administer.
So this actually sparks a huge debate in the research. What happens if the environment is just too volatile for a strict treatment plan? Plan change assumes we actually have enough certainty to define the future state right at the starting line. But emerging change theorists, like Bernas and Weick, argue that in highly complex, uncertain environments, change isn't something you can just plan from the top down. Instead, it's enacted continuously from the bottom up through ongoing sense-making and local improvisation. The leaders don't control the trajectory, they just create the conditions for adaptation.
If the traditional data-driven diagnostic paradigm feels a bit too rigid for you, dialogic organizational development offers a sort of conversational therapy. It's all about shifting narratives to create emergent order right from the ground up. This is a fascinating shift. Instead of Lewin or Kotter's expert-driven approach, Dialogic OD, which was proposed by Bush and Marshak, argues that organizations are basically just social constructions maintained by language. So you change the organization by changing the conversations. You use large group dialogues to generate new meaning and new identities, rather than just forcing a planned intervention down from the top.
And finally, Part 4, the prognosis, matching diagnosis to action.
Look, you wouldn't give a patient a multivitamin if they actually needed open heart surgery, right? The treatment has to match the diagnosis. The key integrative principle from all this research is that mismatches are the primary source of that 60 to 70% failure rate we talked about right at the beginning. If you apply a rigid planned approach like Kotter's to a highly volatile environment that actually needs emergent complexity theory management, you're going to fail. If you apply a radical intervention when you literally only needed an incremental process tweak, you're just causing unnecessary chaos. The depth and the type of change required absolutely must be matched to the approach you adopt.
I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative question to chew on, especially regarding the risks and realities of leading change in your own fast-paced organization. Is there ever a time when the external forces are moving so fast that skipping a formal diagnosis and jumping straight into emergent action is the only way to survive? Or does skipping the diagnosis practically guarantee you'll become just another failure statistic? Think really carefully about how you apply these frameworks the next time your organization starts feeling the pressure to transform.